Good evening and welcome to another episode of Be Inspired, a weekly dose of a show that's dedicated to bringing you inspirational figures, talking, sharing about their experience, their journey. And I hope you've had a good week, and especially to our younger audience, I hope you're satisfied and happy with your GCSE results. And I know, speaking from last week, with a lot of youngsters doing the A-level results, they were switched. I hope you've got the place that you were striving for. But let's talk about this week's show. I've got a young, inspirational figure who, I have to say, has taken the British politics by storm. This is a young British Bangladeshi member of parliament. In fact, I'm proud to say she's my local MP, who has come from a family whose late father was an amazing, inspirational figure as a local politician, a community activist, a campaigner. And she, fast forward 20 years, as a very young age, I won't give the age away, has now become one of the youngest member of the British Parliament, only the fourth British Bangladeshi of origin to be a member of Parliament. I'm talking about no other than Apsana Begum, MP. So let's introduce her. Let's welcome her onto our show. Apsana, good evening, and thank you for taking the time. What is supposed to be a recess for you hardworking parliamentarians, but I've kind of got you to give up your evening to spend with us and hopefully our viewers across the world. So thank you for joining us. And how you been?
Yeah, good evening. Thanks so much for inviting me, and it's really good to join you and speak to you on this show. And you say it's recess, of course it is, but it's still very important to keep in touch and communicate. And this is a great platform that you have to be able to do that. So it's a pleasure to join you.
No, a little birdie tells me a couple of your siblings are regular viewers because they enjoyed my previous show when I had Afia on talking about her cooking sort of success. So I hope they're watching the TV as well. But let's start by talking. Well, first of all, we know you're a member of Parliament. You got elected in 2019 December. What was an amazing experience because it was sort of a rush job to get you selected because the election was called. You were the people's choice in your constituency. People chose you. And then it was a short battle for election. And then you became an MP. But before I want to talk all about that, I want you to sort of talk about you, the Apsana Begum from the early days. Let's talk about Apsana from the early days. You know, the red color is a giveaway. I remember which secondary school you went. So all the girls at your secondary school have just got their GCSE results. Let's start off why you congratulated them and talking about your experience from Marlbury Girls' School onwards.
Yeah, so I mean, firstly, congratulations to everybody that's received GCSE results. And this year has been particularly difficult in terms of results, as we can see, with the various fiascos in terms of results. But nonetheless, I think young people across the constituency and across the borough as a whole should be incredibly proud of their achievements and their efforts, because we know that young people in Tower Hamlets have many barriers that they're having to overcome in order to achieve and obtain qualifications, and then struggles in the labour market and seeking employment. So I think every single young person should be incredibly proud of their achievements. And of course, I can't help but obviously think about my own school, Marlbury School for Girls, which is where I obtained my GCSEs. And isn't it wonderful that you have two MPs who both...
Well, I was going to say that. I mean, most schools talk about success and doctors and lawyers, but Marlbury Girls' School in Tower Hamlets can say, well, not just one, but now they have two members of Parliament. So what's in the school lunch? I want to know. What are they feeding you guys?
It's interesting, isn't it? Because looking back at my experiences of being a secondary school pupil at Marlbury School for Girls, I mean, one thing that was very clear was that the teachers were incredibly supportive. I didn't end up applying for Oxford or Cambridge, but I was certainly encouraged. And I still remember I was the first cohort of pupils. I stayed on for sixth form, so I was the first cohort of pupils to undertake A-level in philosophy and ethics. And I didn't know much about the subject beforehand at all. But probably come across, Plato, in some books or another, but I didn't actually, I'd never studied Western philosophy prior to that. And I still remember, and I think she's still at the school, one of my teachers, sort of saying to me, why aren't you applying? And why don't you, broaden your horizons? And the encouragement was always there. at that school. And I think, we have seen great examples of what women, young women in that school have gone on to achieve. And I'm proud to sort of say that I'm a former student at Marlborough School for Girls.
Well, full credit to the teachers and most obviously the students. And I look forward to maybe in a few years another member of Parliament or maybe the United Nations from because the Marlborough School has an amazing link with United Nations and service and work. Okay, but let's talk about Apsana post school, post university, the making of Apsana, the activist, the change maker. How did that all? Obviously, I talked about your late father, who was a very kind, very considerate, a very accommodating. Because my early days, he was a councillor and activist in Stradbroke area, and we did a lot of good work together. So, where did your kind of politicking ideas and thoughts start?
It's really actually hard to put. I often get asked this question. So, when did you get involved? And it's really hard to put a start date, because I think so much of life here in Tower Hamlets, and as second and third generation British Bangladeshis, in some ways your life experiences mean that you have no choice but to be involved in activism or in political activity, just almost by virtue of your DNA in some ways, because of the various struggles, whether that was the anti-racism movement or, struggles against various policies that have put communities at a detriment, and because of that being involved, I think probably if I could think of my earliest, I would say, political memory, and it's not a party political memory as such, but it is nonetheless a political memory, is actually my father. So he was a parent governor in my primary school, and I remember actually taking a very sort of different view. Probably I was around 8 or 9 years old, and there was a meeting after school. I can't exactly remember the topic. It might have been something around school uniforms, and I remember there being something about school uniforms at the school, whether they should impose them or not impose them, and what that would mean for families that are not able to afford uniform. But at the same time, what uniforms mean in terms of if every child is wearing the same item of clothing, then there is less prejudice and classism, if you like. And I remember, after school, there was a big parents' meeting. It was a school assembly, and there I was sitting next to my father, and he stood up and he was, making a lot of points, but he was quite angry, and he was, almost shouting. And I remember sort of just pulling his shirt and pulling his coat, and I said, "Dad, sit down, Abba, please sit down." And I felt embarrassed. I was like, he's just, why is he challenging them? This is a school. I love my school. Why is he doing this? And he sort of looked at me, and he sort of looked at me really angry, like, you don't know what I'm doing. And then it took me a while of sort of thinking, and then sort of witnessing afterwards that, just a simple act of lots of other parents kind of saying, you spoke and you just sort of said exactly what I wanted to say, but you just articulated it better. And, seeing him sort of, every single time the school elections would come, and we were actually leafleting. I was leafleting with him at 8 years old outside the school. 2001, when he became a councillor, leafleting outside Marlborough School. And those, I guess, little kind of ways of exposure to political activity and then party political activity, I think, gave me an understanding of, I guess, institutionally what the Labour Party is about, but also kind of community organising in a lot of ways as well. And then also being able to develop my own thoughts and opinions. And, you mentioned my brother, and I think, he is, for me, if I had to think about political influences, even though I feel, and he often felt, he didn't have a lot to give in a big way in the political environment. He wasn't a huge policy maker. He didn't identify as that. He didn't identify as a huge innovator. But I think sometimes those really small things can be really profound. And one of those things was that he allowed for political disagreement. So he was okay with me having a different political view to him, which in some ways can seem like quite a small thing, but it's actually quite profound. And I think the second thing was really, he had 6 daughters. So for him, being a girl was never a barrier to anything. And I think just that really small but really, really powerful kind of interaction with somebody that doesn't actually make you feel that politics or whatever field it is in any way unable to be open to you, I think had a huge impact the whole way through in my life so far, and I think has made me either, has either opened up doors or has made me, smash those doors down and open them for myself.
So, I mean, you said, and I'm not correcting, but I'm just sort of extending, because I had the fortune of being involved in some of those political discussions, some of those meetings with your dad, and whether it be a big, elaborate 50-page report or a small suggestion, the kind of work that you see, or the improvement that you see in your constituency, you're now the MP, for the constituency, but the ward your dad represented, Shadwell, right? All that regeneration, knocking down those old buildings, the new improvement around Watney. As chair of the regeneration board, he was the chair and I was the vice chair. It was his ideas. It was him saying to officers whose job was to go out there and write the 50-page report, but it was his direction to say, this will be beneficial to the area. This will improve the landscape. This will improve the connectivity. Whether he used those words or not, but it was his experience of living, breathing, and working with the community actually did that. So I just wanted to say that, because publicly I'm recognizing, and as a young man then myself, I was under his influence, in the sense that he was chair, I was vice chair of that board, and he would always say, because maybe my English was a little bit more faster than his, nephew, go and talk. As a Bangladeshi elderly gentleman, he would refer to me as a nephew. You carry on. I'm behind you. So I just wanted to say that he had an amazing way of words, and he would encourage us. And so I just wanted to say that to you. You talked about a disagreement. Now, you are an elected an MP. You are obviously a Labour Party MP. When you were selected, you had at that time the leader and the second most important person in the Labour Party coming out to support you. I mean, there are 500 plus MPs from the Labour Party who stood, but you had the backing of John McDonnell and Jeremy Corbyn. I mean, how did that, as a young Bangladeshi woman standing for MP first time round, to have the two of the most important senior figures in your party come out and campaign and advocate for you? How did that feel?
It felt amazing, because I think in a lot of ways these were politicians that have been around in Parliament for a very long time, and as somebody who has not actually held political office before, so I've not actually been a post holder before, although I've worked alongside politicians and I've worked on a number of campaigns, to get that direct, I guess, kind of endorsement meant a lot, and it meant that I could also put forward what my political views are and were more strongly, and I did feel like it could help define me for those that didn't know me before. And as you say, it was quite a short selection and quite a short election as well, and it was important to be able to communicate those kind of messages as to where I stand politically in the shortest, quickest way possible. So I was absolutely thrilled to get that endorsement, and also to have Diane Abbott come down, the first black woman MP to come down and help with the campaign launch. I think that, and the conversations that I had around the time, even with herself, for example, as to her experiences. And I think before then I'd been elected to various positions in the local party. I'd but I maybe had myself not really thought that one day I would go on to be the MP for the local
Just
area.
on that, I should sort of inform the people. You talked about coming through the grassroots, so the party structure. You are the first British Bangladeshi woman to be elected as the secretary of your local Labour Party, right? Which, and people will think, well, an area like Tower Hamlets with such a big Bangladeshi population, that has never happened. You've had the MP in your neighbouring constituency. You've had the likes of Baroness Uddin, who became a baroness, who was a former councillor. But no British Bangladeshi woman has ever stood or got elected. Stood first of all, but also got elected as the general secretary of the Tower Hamlets Labour group. I mean, the party, which is a big deal at that time. It was
yeah, and it shouldn't really be. But I think what you kind of point to is actually a structural issue. So why is it that in 2017 that was the only time when a Bangladeshi woman had been elected secretary in an area which has in the borough about 33% of the population being of Bangladeshi background. So I mean, one of the ways in which I looked at that situation, and I didn't just go for it because I'm a Bangladeshi woman, although I did feel, a responsibility. I do feel a responsibility on my shoulders being a Bangladeshi woman in the public domain. But it was again about, well, what can I bring to that? And, why hasn't this happened yet? And, professionally at the time, I was working in the diversity and inclusion sector, and I could easily bring forward many of the measures, steps that I had implemented in different sectors, whether that was in housing or higher education, for example, into the political arena as well, to actually be able to discuss issues of representation and equality as well, which I think, as a Labour Party politician, I have to, be able to look at things with, with a critical eye. And I think we were able to do that quite a bit in the last few years to really understand, the membership of the party, and then also to understand what that means in terms of representation at a higher level. And the old sort of saying about whether Bangladeshi members or BAME members, we are there, we are in the membership of the party, but we know that we are not just there for the bloc support and vote for the Labour Party in this country, and we're not also just there for the fundraisers and funding the party, but we actually deserve representation as a community in the country as well. And I think those things are things that did definitely motivate me as well.
Yeah, I just want to bring that up because I mean that's an inspiring story in the sense that to be, like it's one thing to be seen now as an MP, but you earn your badge, as they say, by knocking the doors and knocking gaining those positions in the early days. So let's fast forward. What is it? 2019, December. I think it was quite a wet, miserable day. I mean, the weather was not very good, right? God, I've got a photo somewhere. Excel Center. I think it's about 3 in the morning or something. Right? You get called. You get a whisper in your ear by your agent. Apsana, you've done it. Right? I remember taking a photo with you. You were so like, and your sister was nearby or something. Tell us, when you're walking up to that podium, when you've been told, right? For those who've been elected, who've held public office, you get told just before you get on the podium that you've won, right? And to get that result read out, X thousands, in fact, you've got 20,000 majority from your nearest candidate. How did you feel? I don't think I've ever asked you that in 10 months.
Yeah. It was in some ways a bittersweet sort of feeling, because a lot of the activists at a local level, had said, we'll be going out to the marginals, rightly so. And that's what they wanted to focus in on, because they were sort of saying, well, this is a safe Labour seat, you'll win. The majority is a different matter here, but you'll definitely win. We're sure of that. Just feeling completely sort of very humbled by that support, and recognizing the desperation that people felt, and the hopes that they had to really have a Labour government. And in this era we have constituents that obviously largely support the Labour Party and really want to see Labour government, but just realizing and seeing queues at the polling station going to vote because of that one hope that actually finally can we get a Labour government that's actually going to represent the working class, represent our interests, and feeling that, but also feeling that bittersweetness in terms of losing the election, and what we understand of that election being a Brexit election, and the errors, I suppose, if you like, that were made that led to that defeat, and only also then being vindicated of the actual manifesto and the policies only a few months later, even before the pandemic hit, recognizing that actually once the issues of Brexit were dealt with, people still wanted all those things that actually were put in and being represented in the 2019 Labour Party manifesto were the things that people actually want once we had dealt with the issues of Brexit. So feeling that vindication, but afterwards feeling that bittersweetness in terms of winning, but also losing at national level, and thinking about, I guess, what to do going forward, because there is a mountain to climb to get support from other areas beyond Poplar and Limehouse, right?
Mm-hmm. Okay, so we're going to, obviously, we talked about the fact you were the first, in a sense that you broke the glass ceiling around local constituency, being the first British Bangladeshi person to be in a position as General Secretary of your Labour Party. You then got elected as the first British Bangladeshi woman in your constituency. For a number of years, it's been occupied by people of other background. And I'm saying this because I think it's a moment of historical moment. You enter Parliament, the Green Chambers, right, as the fourth, well, one of four only British Bangladeshi Muslim MP. Now, you are there because people of all background have elected you, but you are a Muslim woman by the fact that you wear a headscarf. And if I'm right, you're the only Muslim woman in the Mother of Parliament, as it is known, right, in the British Parliament. And you take your oath. And the whole world, and I mean, I'm not exaggerating, the whole Muslim world is looking at you. I mean, how did that feel?
It's interesting looking back at that, even though just that week, because it was a December election, which meant that, you know, it hasn't actually happened in such a long time, having a December election. So over in Parliament, you know, the House of Commons staff, which, you know, it'd be normally quite a quiet period, because they'd be sort of wrapping up for the Christmas, but here we are sort of being shipped in to kind of do our oaths, and I hadn't even realized that it was going to be done, you know, in a matter of days. So Thursday was the election, Friday morning, you know, result. So we were scurrying just to kind of close down our campaign office and give the keys back. And then, lo and behold, on Tuesday, you know, Sunday was called in for an induction just to be shown around the place, and that was the first time I had actually entered the chamber. So I had actually never been in the House of Commons chamber, and we had the doorkeepers give us a tour. A lot of it just went over your head because you're just sort of overwhelmed by being, you know, just going through an election, just trying to get everything organised, and then be given a tour, and then we walked into the chamber. And then we were sort of told, well, yeah, as you'll be aware, Tuesday you'll be taking your oath. And because there were lots of things to sort of get passed and through Parliament in relation to Brexit, there was a bit of a rush to get things done. But I remember walking into the chamber for the first time when the house was full, and I walked up the stairs and there was a seat that was available. I went in and sat, and I did definitely feel on the opposite side, you know, the government side, quite a few heads sort of turned, because I was just so visibly sort of apparent in terms of my presence. And we have these little booklets that sort of have everybody's names and everybody's parties, and I could sort of see some MPs from the government side sort of looking through those books and sort of pointing like, okay, yeah, okay, well, that's this person, that's this person. So yeah, and funnily enough, even in the first week, I had somebody from the table office, which is where, you know, you submit sort of questions, you submit your ballot for the Prime Minister's questions, for example, and there was a young lady, Bangladeshi, who's working there, and she also wears a hijab, and she came to see me, well, she came sort of about a week after that, and sort of said, I'm having a lot of people approach me and say, you know, really, you know, saying really nice hellos and having long sorts of chats. I think they think I'm you, and that kept happening to her. Right. And so we spoke for a bit, and it was nice to see another.
Well, you know what? That's a really nice story, because, you know, many years ago, you know, I remember reading about it. In fact, I was at a talk, and somebody said that when they first entered Parliament, that their experience was somewhat less. You know, they were mistaken for one of the staff members who wasn't, you know, like the other young Bangladeshi woman who's a clerk or as an official. They got mistaken for the janitor, or, you know, the cleaning staff. So, you know what? I'm pleased to hear that. Thank you for sharing that story. That at least the young Bangladeshi woman who works in Parliament is getting praise from, you know, one assumes the opposition parties or people of elder generation or who've been in Parliament for a number of years. So you're definitely changing and shaking the place up, and it's good to see the Bangladeshis, you know, shaking the Parliament and making it lively and more inclusive. But just talk us about that induction, that sort of, you know, from closing the campaign office to opening up your new office in Parliament. I mean, that feeling, as you said, only 18 years ago, you were outside the school gate with your father giving out leaflet for a school election, to now a member of Parliament. I mean, how did that feel?
I think in a lot of ways, just looking back at that really small period between sort of the election sort of finishing and then, you know, coming into Parliament and opening up office in Parliament, it was obviously, you know, a lot of the offices were closed in December, so we were sort of rushed through a sort of induction process, much like sort of going into an open day at university. That's, you know, a lot of people sort of describe Parliament, I think particularly some of the new MPs describe Parliament as sort of being in Hogwarts, and it sort of felt like that with the old kind of features. And when sort of going in, shipped in, you know, doing lots of different training courses and sessions just to familiarize yourself with the environment, but also serious elements in terms of policy, whether that was safeguarding or whether that was, you know, GDPR policies and how that would operate. Because essentially, as a member of Parliament, you are, it's almost like being self-employed. So, you know, you are setting up your own office, you are setting up your own team, you're going to be undertaking recruitment, you're going to be managing and leading a team in order to lead your constituency and in order to deliver for your constituency. So that initial period, I think, was one which was quite, in a lot of ways quite chaotic, because we were waiting for, you know, the turnover to take place. So those that had unfortunately lost their seats, you know, their offices being emptied and then us being given keys. So I think eventually most of us that are new MPs that hadn't had an office space before were given keys at the end of January. But that did not mean to say that obviously there wasn't a demand for MPs to be advocating and representing their constituents. So practically speaking, it was essentially me with a laptop in the cafeteria for, you know, about a month. But, you know, but it just felt like, okay, well, that phase is now finished, and this is now the phase of setting up and getting started and doing the work that needs to be done. And that flexibility, the honor of having the flexibility and the privilege of setting up things the way that you know works best for you, is
can I ask a question? Like, obviously we know you've taken over from the previous MP locally. Do you know whose office you took over? Are you able to share, or is that sort of?
Funnily enough, so I we were sort of given options to go to different parts of the parliamentary estate, and again I was familiarizing myself with all the different buildings because I hadn't worked in Parliament before. I'd only been there once prior to my election for a campaign meeting, and I'd actually visited my predecessor, so I'd met with my predecessor before the selection process for a coffee, and he showed me around a bit. Although I didn't go to his office, I'm not quite sure where his office was located, but there are different sites on Parliament, and I wanted to be as close as possible to the chamber. And if those, I suppose, that are familiar with the environment, those that are not, should, I guess, know that you often obviously have votes, and the votes are sort of notified by text messages from your whips, but through division bells. So the bell will start ringing. It will sort of run for about 10 minutes to allow you time to get to the chamber, which is sufficient from whichever place you are based in Parliament in terms of your office. But I still wanted to be as close as possible to the chamber, and so I was lucky enough to have an office in Portcullis House, which, you know, I think some of the more experienced, longer serving MPs have. But I chose a much smaller room, which happened to be a print room previously, so it was a room for printers. I was happy with that. I'm more than happy with it because the location was fine. So so it's nice to have an office in Parliament.
So for viewers who are thinking, so you've got the Parliament, the kind of the old Gothic looking building, and Portcullis House is the one next to it. It was a much more of a modern like a building with the links underneath the tunnel, which is always fun to see MPs run. Hope you got your running shoes on. Okay, so look, thank you for that. We're sort of halfway through the show, and for those who've just tuned in, you're thinking, who is this amazing, inspirational young person that I'm talking to? Well, this is no other than our local British Bangladeshi-born member of Parliament, Apsana Begum, who are talking to us this evening on Be Inspired. Stick it around for the next 20-odd minutes. We'll talk more about Apsana and her likes and dislikes. More likes, I hope. Apsana, so member of Parliament, you've got your induction, you've got your training, you've got your office, and wow, conversations, the flood of emails, and how are you keeping on top of these things? Because, you know, you've got a very busy schedule. You're dealing with Brexit. We're going to come to the COVID, but before all that, new MP, how do you get your balance? I mean, how do you manage? And as I said, you're also like starting up a new business. You've got to recruit secretaries, PAs, researchers, and office people. How do you balance all that? And the fact that you've not, like you said, prior to that, you've only been to the Parliament a few times, although you're a campaign-led person, but you're running your own office. You're running your own, like, it's not running a small business. How did you go about doing it?
I think every single MP, being elected for the first time, it doesn't matter if you'd actually worked in Parliament before or worked for an MP before. I think the challenges are the same for everyone, and I think those initial, I guess I would say, sort of 3 to 6 months of being elected are in some ways the most crucial, but also the most sort of challenging, because you're racing to get everything set up so that you can be out there making your surgeries as productive as possible, being able to advocate and being able to participate in particular debates or for crucial decisions that are being made and crucial pieces of legislation that are being passed. So I think in some ways, if I'm being honest, there isn't a balance. You are just sort of working round the clock just to get everything set up, and I think probably every MP can relate to that to some degree. And in fact, I sat in trying to take a break a couple of times and just speaking to some of my colleagues, they'd all express the sort of same thing, that oh yeah, first 6 months you probably just won't see the wood for the trees. You just keep just going and not realize that you've not really had a bit of a break. And I think that for many of the new MPs that entered Parliament, and that story will resonate with many of us. But it was also quite fun as well to be able to sort of think about the various opportunities there are to actually put forward your views, but also your campaigns, and learning that quite quickly as well in terms of things that would be presented to you, whether that was parliamentary groups or whether that was external organisations that are working with MPs or willing to work with MPs, and discovering that and actually realising that maybe previously as a campaigner and as an activist there were some limitations, and there are limitations being a member of Parliament in terms of activism, but what are the opportunities there which are slightly different to if I was just a campaigner and activist. And I think those doors opening up felt really good in a lot of ways.
Obviously, we talked about the fact there's a lot of new MPs come. I think I was going to say, it feels like you said, it's like a freshers week, right? So you get to meet some new MPs, you make new friends. I mean, I obviously follow a number of you guys on social media, and I'm sure talking tonight, a lot of people will go on your social media feeds and start following you, I hope, as well. There's a young MP from Coventry. I mean, you're young. My God, she's even younger, right? Have you started to make friends with sort of new generation of Labour, or dare I say, non-Labour MPs? Does that happen?
I think, as an MP, for example, being, I sit as a member of the Education Committee, and I work, my chair is obviously a Tory MP, and building those relationships across the board is really, really important, because if I'm given the opportunity, if I'm successful in a ballot which allows for a private member's bill to be introduced, or a new piece of legislation to be introduced, it'd be good to get the support, or across the board, really, not just from Labour colleagues, but also from the government side. And you mentioned sort of Zara Sultana, who's a fantastic MP for Coventry South, and there definitely is the feeling that the new intake of MPs, particularly on the Labour side, we've now allowed for the Parliamentary Labour Party to reflect the diversity in a greater way than before of the country at hand. And that solidarity between different groups of people within Parliament is, I think, really important for support, because in a lot of ways the parliamentary customs procedures are still very archaic. They're not going to change overnight. Sometimes you kind of question where this came from, why this is the way that things need to be done. You can accept that, participate in that as you would as an MP, but also to be able to relate to others' experiences, similar experiences like yourself, in that environment, which is still overall, despite, for example, as I say, it being maybe one of the most diverse parliaments, still quite disconnected, I think, from the average person outside of Parliament. And I often feel, on reflection, that I think maybe some procedures and some customs are almost designed to protect the status quo and to maybe prevent radical ideas and radical thinking to take platform in that chamber and to be put forward as legislation. And that's the challenge, I think.
Now, just a final thought, and when you talk to football stars and they get elevated to the first team, and they're sitting around David Beckham's and whatever. So you now, as a young member of parliament, you're sitting in the benches, you look on your left and your right, you've got senior Labour figures that you maybe once, like talked about or you'd read about, as a young, relatively new MP, or you look across the bench and you see, I was going to say, I'm going to be nice, but, not caricature of certain characters, but, I can think of one or two that you read about in the papers that they have somewhat arcade policies and ideas. Do you sort of, I don't know, what sort of comes into your head? Like, oh my God, those characters.
Yeah, I think in some ways it's sort of, there's often this term that's used, right, Westminster bubble, and it's easy to get swept away in that, where you do have to spend a lot of time in person in Parliament. So if I look at my schedule, I know that when Monday to Wednesdays is a complete must to be kept clear in terms of votes and activity in Parliament, where I physically have to be there to go and vote. And that's a lot of time that you are already spending away from your constituents. And it's easy to get swept up in that, with all the, I wouldn't say the glamour of it, but I would say just the environment of it really being about, people's careers and, the next steps for them moving forward, as opposed to maybe, the average person that is really struggling, and what can really be done to develop a campaign or to develop a policy or a law that really changes something and really, really does change something, because it does feel like there needs to be a greater level of activity and action to bring about change at that level than there would be elsewhere, because those structures are in place, as I say, almost designed to prevent that from happening. But, of course, I think, people that you just being in the chamber, just sort of seeing that on TV only before and then being there yourself, getting used to that environment. But yes, absolutely seeing colleagues that, reading about their stories, their journeys, bills that they've introduced in Parliament and had passed, and being able to, converse with them about how they went about doing that has been really key. And yeah, the occasional sort of, I think, oh gosh, did I just walk past, this MP who's now actually one of my colleagues, and having sort of limited interaction, or just maybe seeing them at the event, at an event at the very most prior to this. In some ways, I think it was probably the first time I'd met Ed Miliband, for example. He was Labour Party leader, and sort of just walking passing. I think we were at a reception held by GMB Union, and just having a conversation, just realised actually I'm speaking to my colleague, not just the MP for Doncaster, but actually speaking to a colleague.
Thank you for that. Now, you talked about experience. Now, since you've been elected, there's been a somewhat of a trend of people seeing you, like being there, seeing you rise to the top, or be elevated, sort of elected to the Parliament, has inspired a cross-Atlantic relationship. Now, I've seen more of young Bangladeshi of origin in America, in different places in America, particularly, who've now taken to pursuing public life, and they sort of see you as, if Apsana can do it in London, I can do it in New York, I can do it in New Jersey, I can do it in Michigan. So how did that become? Because you literally become like their symbol of, like, what, Apsana is my great role model, and I want to be like Apsana. How did that sort of go about? And obviously you've been doing back and forth on social media and Twitter and stuff. How do you feel about that?
I don't know if there's a direct link between me and them in terms of them and their activities. What's been really humbling is to see, yes, as you sort of mentioned, it seems to be a group of Bangladeshi women and men that have organised themselves in their communities to really take up some campaigns that have previously not had the voice given to them, and they hadn't been given voice before. They've come out of whether that's their studies or whether that's their places of work, and they've started to organise, whether that's been on housing rights, tenants' rights, education rights, and they've then ended up standing for elected positions, again for the first time in their lives, knowing full well that they stand little chance, and in some cases they've lost, but they nonetheless see that just as a step towards not achieving something for themselves, but to just bring about change for their local area. So I've been following quite a lot in terms of the activities of some of the activists in Bronx and Queens, and seeing the way in which, like very much in Tower Hamlets, those connections being built, and those activities being progressed on a number of social issues. And I think there's so much that we can really learn from their experience, but they can also learn from us. And I think, because of our diaspora, because of our background, but the American experience is not going to be too by from the British experience. So I think that transatlantic kind of solidarity is really important going forward. I read an article by one of the activists there, and two of them had put themselves forward for election. And what happened was the governmental body responsible for issuing ballot papers didn't put their names on the ballot papers, essentially because I think one of them had a name which could be spelled in various different ways. And another had a name, her first name is Mary, and they just didn't recognize it. So, how can a Bangladeshi have the name Mary? And that was her first name, but she was known, as many people are, she was known by her second name, Jubaida, and they were refused to go on the ballot. And sort of them undertaking that journey politically of explaining to the government that actually, sometimes we have nicknames, sometimes we have names at home, and sometimes, some of our names can be spelled differently. My name is an Urdu name, which is supposed to be spelled with an F, but it's spelled with a P, get over it. But to see that in practice, but also they, as women, as young women, also coming into a field which is quite, dominated by men, and also grappling with that. So again, I think being able to relate, I think, in terms of the British experience here, in terms of even the Bangladeshi community or the ethnic minority community as more widely, as to recognizing the legacies and the contributions of our forefathers and those that came before us, particularly in terms of the anti-racism movement, for example, locally, and really knowing and understanding from them that power concedes nothing without demand, as is said, and then also to be able to kind of break through some patriarchal structures and also being a bit more radical as well. So, the idea of there being, a good immigrant, a bad immigrant, and, for generations before us, having to really try to be the good immigrant by no choice apart from, really trying to put food on the plate and also send money back home, to then, our generation, which is more privileged in terms of education and work opportunities, and then also being able to have a different contribute, but also have a different political perspective, which may be slightly more radical and slightly more willing to challenge the state apparatus, as it were. Excellent.
Well, look, I'm conscious of time. I have taken a lot of your time, but before I go, I got to finish off. Well, hopefully we'll finish off on a more of a lighter note. But before that, something obviously we are living in very unprecedented times. The COVID situation has made life difficult for everyone. Obviously, your own constituency. The fact that people just walk into your surgery. One of the great things about being a member of Parliament, on a Thursday or Friday or even the weekends, you could hold surgery. People could come and see you, share the problems. But now, obviously, they have to innovate, talk to you by, I guess, on the phone, by emails and stuff. The country is in well, let's be a little bit political. The country is in a mess, right? Now, as a member of Parliament, challenging the government and on behalf of your constituents, what is it that gets you up and says, what, I got to do more? Even though my constituency, you've got Canary Wharf in your constituency, which is one of the largest private estate in the country, but then you've got lots of deprivations, you've got inequalities. What is it that gets you up now in the morning and says, what, I'm still going to knock harder, I'm still going to push that door because my constituency, those people who are suffering? What is it that gets you drive? What's your drive? Now, you've been elected. You're now going to be in Parliament for hopefully for many, many, many years to come. You're the guy before you was there for 20-something years, right? But what is that drive that you have in the morning?
I think it's just not being able to sit back and just watch this happen. So, quite rightly, you say it's all in a sort of a bit of a mess right now in the country, and that makes me angry. And then what do I do with that anger? And then you've got to challenge it. And I think that's in some ways what has happened with my activism. It's trying to put that to good use, to try and channel it in a way that's beneficial and tries to do good with it. And I think a lot of my personal life experiences have also meant that I feel that I can't just sit back, that I don't recognize my own personal experiences and life experiences as being personal to me, but being able to recognize that there are still structural reasons why maybe I have experienced what I've experienced, and maybe my neighbor has experienced what they've experienced, or somebody else who's now my constituent has experienced what they've experienced. And there are commonalities in those experiences. I often talk about child poverty in the constituency, right, being of the highest level in the entire country. It's not something that I want to be, proud of to keep repeating, but I say that because I can relate to that on a personal level, but I can also understand the structural reasons why we are in this place. And I guess in some way, that keeps me going. In some way, that I feel that it's a responsibility in some ways for me to be able to do what I can do. It has not meant in some ways that I am able to do other things that I might want to do with my life. And I recognize that that's a sacrifice, a personal sacrifice that I make in order to contribute something greater, more long term, and something that has an impact on lots more people than just myself. And I think that's always been a bit of the motivation. It's something that has an impact on lots of people, as opposed to just me or just a small group of people.
Thank you, Apsana. But before we forget, before we kind of wrap it up, a lot of the time I ask my viewers, what is the obviously you're an inspirational person. You're there on a daily basis doing amazing work, not just for your constituency, but for sticking up for the people in the country. But what does Apsana do when she is not being the MP? What is it that you do to sort of make yourself a bit like us, normal people? What is it that you enjoy cooking? Do you enjoy reading? What some of my viewers want to know is what's behind the scene, does Apsana really do when she's not being so motivated to change the world?
I think in a lot of ways it's so important to practice the self-care, because I'm not immune like anybody else is. Because I'm an MP, I'm not immune from the racism and the discrimination and the sexism that the average person is experiencing in the constituency and beyond. In fact, in some ways, I wouldn't say it's greater as a member of parliament, but it's more intense in a different sort of way. And to experience that at a high level, like in parliament, because I still recognise myself just as the ordinary constituent. I was just a constituent just a few years back. I don't see how, in some ways, I've changed. But to answer your question in terms of what I do to maybe switch off to get a bit of balance is I love listening to music. So music is just a way in which it's probably always in the background when I'm working. I love music. I love exploring language. So I'm always sort of exploring my heritage. So I'm actually, interested to learn more about Bangladeshi history or, Bangladeshi culture. And I do that exploration a lot, or as much as I can, through language. And the South Asian diaspora overall in terms of language. So that's one of the things that I do. And I am, I guess, looking for ways in which to challenge myself personally in terms of my personal growth. So, looking at ways in which I can maybe take up something that I haven't previously done. And so I'm using a bit of my personal time to do that.
Excellent. Well, look, thank you so much for your time this evening, Apsana. So we want to wish you the best luck in terms of, we look forward to following your work in Parliament and representing your constituency, and for truly being an inspirational conversation this evening, not just for viewers in the UK, but I'm sure across the world sort of think that you are representing the voice of the community and looking the part as a British Bangladeshi Muslim MP in Parliament. We wish you the very best of luck, and thank you once again for taking your time to be with us. Viewers,
thanks for having me. Thank you.
Pleasure. Thank you very much. So viewers, I hope you've enjoyed that. We'll be back once again next week with another episode, talking to another inspirational figures. Until we meet again, stay well, be inspired.